Stop killing games. There's a topic I haven't covered in months, but there have been enough new developments that this topic and situation merits conversation. So Stop Killing Games, for those who don't know, is a movement kickstarted by Accursed Farms over here. You can see this initial video when the campaign first started back in April 2nd, 2024, highlighting the reason why this movement is so important to this individual. And it's because, well, the basic law of commerce states that when you buy a product, you should be able to keep it, or at the very least, that's how many believe it should work. But with video games being digital and with the access ability of video games being reliant on game companies being able to maintain their servers and all these things, and with all the DRMs and all the dependence on the game company side of things, we're seeing a lot of games just completely get lost where you can't download them again. Licenses are revoked entirely, and so the games are removed from your library, the crew being the thing that kickstarted all of this. But there's so many examples of games that have disappeared from the face of the planet, so preservation isn't there. But beyond that, yeah, digital products are just being straight up stripped away from people's libraries, and that is just not acceptable when people didn't consent to that and when they purchased the product that's being stripped. Now, thanks to Stop Killing Games, we've gotten a number of petitions that have garnered an immense level of support. The main one being this European Citizens Initiative one started by Stop Destroying Video Games that managed to garner almost 1.5 million signatures, which forces this issue to essentially be looked at by the European Union government. And 12 days ago, we got some updates from the Stop Killing Games official subreddit, where they announced that the verification process of the signatures is ongoing, as they need to make sure that the signatures are legitimate. So far, of the almost 1.5 million signatures, 689,035 signatures have been verified. The two largest countries are still missing from this figure, Germany and France. We can expect a lot more signatures to be verified over the coming days and weeks. The real good news is that currently, so far, just 3% of signatures have failed verification. So if that number holds true or stays within that range, that means that by the time signatures are finished being verified, we're going to be well above the 1 million signatures threshold that this movement needs in order for it to be taken to the European Union government. So in terms of presenting this issue to lawmakers and forcing lawmakers to actually take a look at this issue, we're doing really well. Now, another petition that garnered a lot of support is this specific one for the UK government and parliament that has garnered almost 200,000 signatures. This being a petition that ran for 6 months, so pretty good results. And we've gotten to a point now where the UK government has discussed this particular issue, with members of parliament being in support of the Stop Killing Games movement. And so today's story will focus on that particular development. Right here, we have a Video Games Chronicle article published on November 4th, 2025, that details everything that was discussed. Now, unfortunately, the UK government didn't provide a favorable response, insisting that the current consumer protection laws are enough, and sympathizing more with game studios and companies and how hard it might be to implement what Stop Killing Games is asking for. So let's dive in and take a look at this, starting with what members of parliament had to say in favor of the Stop Killing Games movement, starting with Pam Coxier, MP for Colchester, who said the Stop Killing Games movement highlights the growing frustration among players who see their purchases vanish. It is clear that digital ownership must be respected, and that publishers should look to provide routes for players to retain or repair games even if the official service support for products ends. Nobody's asking for companies to support a product ad infinitum. They're just asking that consumers be allowed to keep some aspect of that product that may not be officially supported, but is still, at least on some level, functional. Next up, we have Henry Tufnell here, the MP for Mid and South Pembrokeshire, who said, "I agree about the extent to which games have a cultural identity, and that to take them down erases a cultural and artistic heritage that is vital to society and to the wider industry as well. Video games are art, and we're losing so much art because of the games industry's complete lack of consideration for games preservation. There's just such little effort on that front that so much of gaming history is being completely lost and is vanishing entirely, to the point where future generations will not know about the existence of many of these works of art, all of which are very culturally significant. It's among the newest forms of art, but it's still art, and an art form that will continue to live on for many, many years to come. due to the fact that it's, the biggest industry in entertainment. Next, we got Mark Stewart's MP for Leeds Southwest and Morley, who argued that consumers are asking for a fairly simple guarantee from game makers that they won't suddenly be left with nothing after purchasing a game. Quote, I'm not demanding that publishers keep servers running forever. Campaigners are not asking for indefinite technical support. Correct. We are not asking companies to keep pouring resources into a game that they have finished with. What we're asking is fairly simple, that publishers should not be able to deliberately disable every copy of a game that consumers have already purchased, leaving them with nothing. Right, because that is plain and simply unreasonable. When you hit a button that says make a purchase or buy, the expectation is that you're buying a product that you get to keep. You're not clicking on a button that says rent. You're clicking on a button that says buy. And there's a certain expectation that so long as you take care of that product, it is yours for you to access however much you want without any caveats or restrictions. Your ability to access the products you've purchased shouldn't be up to the companies who have made that product, because there's been a transaction that's taken place that says, in exchange for me giving you my hard-earned money, you will allow me to engage with the product that you're selling, and I'll get to be able to have that product for as long as I want. Mark Seward also makes a great point to highlight that what we're seeing happening with video games is different from, say, an electronics company ending support for a device like an old printer, because at least that product still prints documents. It still works. It still functions. Whereas with video games, he said, quote, what we're seeing with games is different. It is as if someone bought that printer and then one day the manufacturer sent out a signal that deliberately stopped it from working at all, claiming it had reached the end of support. This is not support ending, it is obsolescence, which has an entirely different meaning. That is the MVP quote right there. It is far too easy for companies to make the digital products they've purchased completely obsolete. They have far too much wide-reaching control over products that consumers purchase, to the point where it disrupts the basic concept of commerce. And Mark didn't stop at that. He continued with, although I respect the government's position, I cannot help but observe that what is happening in this space could be perceived as a breach of consumer protection under unfair trading regulations. The fix in this area could be as simple as there being more transparency. When a consumer purchases a game, it should be crystal clear that the publisher could deactivate it at any point. Basically, it should be clear that you're renting a game, not really buying it outright. However, I want to go further. We need to retain something and ensure that publishers make the game playable for consumers long after they have pulled support from it. Just ensure that the game is accessible in some way, shape, or form. It doesn't mean that multiplayer functionalities have to remain online. It doesn't mean that the game has to be in the most optimal state. Even if we're talking about, say, like an MMO that has gone completely offline, but players are still able to access the content, it won't be optimal because they'd need other players to make the experience, the full experience. But at least the game functions enough where it doesn't feel like the product is completely gone. It's still functional enough where you can engage with it on some level. And that way, the game hasn't been completely eradicated or made completely obsolete. That's what we're asking for. Now, that's the bare minimum. Of course, the ideal scenario would be if players could establish their own private servers and find some way to even keep some aspects of the online functionalities still alive, but do it in a more private setting. But then there's also the fact that games that are not online dependent might still get pulled from your library if there are licensing issues on the company's end, or if they have server issues, or if they just shut down entirely to the point where they can't support the ability for players to retain access to their digital games that are so unreasonable in the way consumers are able to completely lose the products that they purchased. This MP talks about The Crew, a game that did not need to be completely shut down. Ubisoft could have patched in offline play or allowed private servers. Going forward, the ask from many consumers is simple. If the industry plans to kill a game, it should ensure that consumers have a reasonable option to continue using their products for a single-player experience or on private servers. Couldn't have put it better myself. The MPs all made, I think, really compelling cases here, but the UK's government, the representative who heard these issues, the Minister for Sport, Tourism, Civil Society and Youth, Stephanie Peacock MP, acknowledged consumer sentiment behind Stop Killing Games, but suggested there were no plans to amend UK law around the issue. So in the UK, at least, we're seeing a major setback in this particular movement, with the government believing that this is just too unreasonable to implement for game developers and game companies. And I'll read the relevant statements from the government right here as transcribed by Video Games Chronicle. Quote, The government recognized the strength of feeling behind the campaign that led to the debate. The petition attracted nearly 190,000 signatures. Similar campaigns, including a European Citizens Initiative, reached over 1 million signatures, referring to the Stop Destroying Video Games initiative that garnered actually closer to 1.4 million signatures. There's been significant interest across the world. Indeed, this is a global conversation because gaming is a global art form, a global mass mainstream form of media. The passion behind the campaign demonstrates that the core underlying principle is a valid one. Gamers should have confidence in the right to access the games that they have paid to play. Yeah, that only seems reasonable, but the government adds a but. At the same time, the government also recognized the concerns from the video game industry about some of the campaign's asks. Online video games are often dynamic, interactive services, not static products. And maintaining online services requires substantial investment over years or even decades. Games are more complex than ever before to develop and maintain, with the largest exceeding the budget of a modern Hollywood blockbuster. That can make it extremely challenging to implement plans for video games after formal support for them has ended, and risks creating harmful unintended consequences for gamers as well as for video game companies. I'm sorry, but that's just not a good excuse. Just because the products that the games industry makes are complex doesn't mean that suddenly absolve them of their responsibilities to consumers who pay them money. I'm not saying this is an easy ask, but it's certainly not an impossible ask, because we've seen time and again games that have gone offline, but they've implemented some kind of single player patch that have allowed them to be accessed even if they're not officially supported. So it is possible. It's just not a model that has been enforced because it's easier for companies to just eradicate a game completely from the face of the planet. But just because something has been the norm doesn't mean it's a good norm. That's why there's a petition for change, because we want things to be different. We want a new normal, a new standard for consumer protection. Risks of creating harmful unintended consequences for gamers. What risks are we talking about here? The risk of gamers getting to keep the products that they purchase? Because that sounds great to me. As for consequences to video game companies, if you can't create products in an ethical way, then you shouldn't be making products at all. Being ethical is inconvenient, but you do it because it's the right thing to do. It's easier to take the immoral road, and that's why there are laws to ensure that those immoralities aren't something that you can get away with without consequences. Video game companies being able to strip products that you purchased away from you, regardless of whether they're physical or digital, is just not right. And if laws are updated so that companies are forced to behave a certain way, then they will. And if that level of basic responsibility to consumers of like, hey, if you buy a product from us, you should get to keep it, is too much for you, then don't be in this industry and don't make products for consumers, and don't ask consumers for money to purchase your product if you can't fulfill your end of the bargain of that commerce transaction. The government's statement continues. A number of members have made points about ownership. It is important to note that games have always been licensed to consumers rather than sold outright. In the 1980s, tearing the wrapping on a box to a game's cartridge was the way that gamers agreed to licensing terms. Today, that happens when we click accept when buying a game on a digital storefront. Licensing video games is not, as some have suggested, a new and unfair business practice. But with the purchase of a game's cartridge, a game company can't break into your house and steal and take that cartridge. It just so happens that modern technology allows for game companies to essentially steal from you without being physically in your home. And when a purchase you made is unreasonably stripped from you because of issues on the company's end, on the service provider's end, or on the product seller's end, when the consumer has done nothing wrong to warrant a product that they purchased being taken back from them, that is just unfair, and that is plain and simply just wrong. You can talk about the technicalities of licensing all you want, but purchasing video game cartridges versus purchasing digital media, I mean, it's just a night and day difference in terms of the security that a customer is allotted in their ability to access the product that they purchased. Licensing video games may not be a new practice, but it has become an unfair business practice because of the sheer power and control it grants corporations over consumers' products. Consumers who can't do anything if a corporation decides that you no longer own that license. And therefore, those products can just be stripped from you without your consent. To try to say that licensing video games is not a new and unfair business practice, and then make the comparison to games cartridges and the way you can purchase those and just keep them forever, the dissonance there is insane because you're practically describing how game purchases have become more and more unfair as things have become more digital and as the presence of the internet has granted companies just that much more control. The government's statement continues here: for gamers used to dusting off their Nintendo 64 to play Mario Kart whenever they like, or in my case, Crash Bandicoot on the PlayStation, without the need for an internet connection, that can be frustrating. But it is a legitimate practice that businesses are entitled to adopt, so it is essential that consumers understand what they're paying for. Existing legislation is clear that consumers are entitled to information that enables them to make informed purchasing decisions confidently. You're literally saying this sucks for customers, but it's a legitimate practice, and it's nothing new, and it's fair. Just because something is legitimate now and it's the standard and normal now doesn't mean that it should be the standard and the normal in the future. And the government says right here that it is essential that consumers understand what they're paying for, except companies have no incentive to be transparent on that front. They have no incentive to say what you're really doing is renting a game for a very long term rather than buying it outright. They keep using terms like buy and purchase as if to suggest to customers that you get to keep the product and access the product forever. They never actually try to warn customers that you won't get to keep these purchases forever, because they know that's bad for PR. But in doing so, consumers don't really understand what they're paying for because they're not being told what they're actually paying for. Instead, they're being lied to through certain verbiage. The government statement then continues: under existing UK legislation, the Consumer Rights Act 2015 requires that digital content must be of satisfactory quality, fit for a particular purpose, and described by the seller. I mean, that's already something that a lot of AAA releases fail at, releasing in really dodgy quality, and especially where live services are concerned, releasing in a state that is not adequate to what was marketed, so on and so forth. It also requires that the terms and conditions applied by a trader to a product that they sell must not be unfair and must be prominent and transparent. Video game companies are certainly failing at that. The Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act of 2024 requires information to consumers to be clear and correct and prohibits commercial practices that, through false or misleading information, cause the average consumer to make a different choice. What game companies ultimately do is bury the appropriate information behind just pages of licensing agreements, stuff that they know people won't read, instead of just warning people outright in simple terms when they purchase their video games that you won't get to keep these video games forever. You're not really buying these games to access for as long as you like, that you're actually just renting these for the long term or for as long as game companies deem it appropriate or are able to offer the services required for that game to be accessible. And by bearing all that information, they give consumers this false sense of security up until the day when the product vanishes from their library and they question what the heck happened because they didn't know that was even a possibility. Now, on the topic of transparency, the UK government does say that points were made about consumer law and ownership. UK law is very clear. It requires information to consumers to be clear and correct. The government are clear that the law works, but companies might need to communicate better. How lenient the government is being here in favor of game companies, the verbiage that they're using, saying they might need to communicate better, not condemning them to the fullest degree, but being wishy-washy about where game companies are going wrong. Like, this doesn't present to me as a government entity that's taking consumer protection seriously. There's such lack of scrutiny for how game companies are operating right now. The statement then continues: in response to a specific point made by a member of parliament, I should say that it is particularly important in cases where projects fail or games have to be pulled shortly after launch that the information provided to consumers is clear and timely. And then we get to the meat of the argument, which is what the Stop Killing Games movement is all about, that even when a game dies, it should be on some level playable or accessible, or just on a fundamental level functional, not completely obsolete. On that front, the government said, I understand that the campaigners argued that rather than just providing clear information, games should be able to be enjoyed offline after developer support has ended, either through an update or a patch, or by handing over service to the gaming community to enable continued online play. In other words, mandating the inclusion of end-of-life plans for always online video games. And also offline games with DRM implemented that will not be accessible if the product provider goes down, if there's some kind of licensing issue, so on and so forth. On that front, the government says that they're sympathetic to the concerns raised, but we also recognize the challenges of delivering such aims from the perspective of the video game industry. They're so light on the scrutiny of the games industry and so heavy in their defense of it. So the reasoning the government provides is that first, such a change in terms of implementing what Stop Killing Games wants would have negative technical impacts on video game development. It is true that there are some games for which it would be relatively simple to patch an offline mode after its initial release. However, the games whose systems have been specifically designed for an online experience, this would not be possible without major redevelopment. Except if you understand what Stop Killing Games is asking for, it clearly states that it is not retroactive. Some games have been designed in that way and there's nothing we can do about it, but at least from here on out, if the new normal can be that all games need to consider some kind of end-of-life implementation so that the product doesn't completely vanish off the face of the earth and the product respects the commerce of consumers paying money for products that they should be able to keep and access, then we're good. If that can be the new normal, then, we can move towards a better future. That's what we're asking for. We're not asking for retroactive readjustments. So yeah, the government doesn't understand this, insisting that requiring an end-of-life plan for all games would fundamentally change how games are developed and distributed. Although that may well be the desired outcome for some campaigners, it is not right to say that the solutions will be simple or inexpensive, particularly for smaller studios. If they prove to be too risky or burdensome, they could discourage the innovation that is the beating heart of this art form. Yeah, let's play the smallest violin for those multi-million and multi-billion-dollar corporations because they have to spend a little more effort and a little more money to enact features that are good for consumers. Boo-hoo. They also don't really go into detail as to how implementing just basic end-of-life something to ensure a game is just on a fundamental level functional would discourage innovation. And then they try to say, won't you think about the smaller studios? But it's the smaller studios that are not beholden to major corporations that tend to push for the most consumer-friendly practices. And a lot of these smaller studios tend to make smaller scale games that don't require a certain level of expense or a certain level of complexity when it comes to keeping a game alive on some level with some kind of end-of-life plan. And not to mention that the practice of some kind of end-of-life plan is nothing new. We've seen games do it before. The government speaks of this concept as if it's something brand new and unheard of and something really fundamentally like landscape changing, when we have seen this practice enacted by certain studios that actually care about their art living on beyond the lifespan of the support of the game. And that's both big and smaller studios. So I guarantee you that just that basic fundamental request of preserve games and on some level, keep them on a basic fundamental level functional is not this ask that will completely ravage the games industry and make it impossible to make games like that. That's just such a DEFCON 1 level of thinking. The statement continues. Secondly, the approach carries commercial and legal risks. If an end-of-life plan involves handing online servers over to consumers, it is not clear who would be responsible for regulatory compliance or for payments to third parties that provide core services. It could also result in reputational harm for video game businesses that no longer officially support their games if illegal or harmful activity took place. The campaign is clear in its statement that it would not ask studios to pay to support games indefinitely. However, it is hard to see solutions to these issues that do not involve significant time, personnel, and monetary investment. Well, the thing is that people hosting private servers also have to follow the law. If they do something predatory with their private servers, then people will report them and they may very well get in trouble. The law discourages them from doing illegal things. And then as far as game companies are concerned, they can just add in their terms of service that once support and service ends for a game, what happens thereafter is not their responsibility because it's quite literally not. These are not officially sanctioned activities and people will do what they will with your product, regardless of whether you approve of it or not. And this concept of private servers for games that have been shut down, like that's not a new thing. That already happens. You can't stop it. And a lot of niche communities are actually thriving off of that because people who love the games that they want to keep alive, they do it out of love for the game, so they will ensure that it's a positive, good environment. Also, it's going to be such a small community because if a game died due to a lack of a community, like enough of a player base for it to be able to be supported, then private servers is not something that will allow abuse on a grand scale. I'm not saying that there aren't drawbacks, but the drawbacks are far outweighed by the benefits of preserving games and allowing customers to have some kind of functional form of a video game that is no longer supported. The final point the government makes here is that Most importantly, from the perspective of gamers, there are the safety and security impacts to consider. Under the Online Safety Act of 2023, video game companies are responsible for controlling exposure to harmful content in their games. Removing official moderation from server or enabling community-hosted servers increases the risk that users, including children, could be exposed to such content. That risk is just inherent to the existence of the internet. Anyone can be exposed to anything. The law still applies to the people hosting these servers, so if something illicit or shady happens, then they can be reported. There is the law to ensure that they face appropriate consequences. With anything in the online environment, even just social media, there's an inherent risk that you'll be exposed to harmful content. But with these niche communities who are supporting games that have died off, like, the more likely scenario is that their love for the game will want them to ensure a more positive community, and it's going to be a small, tight-knit community. But if you're going to talk about risks, risk is just an inherent part of freedom, right? But the benefits of freedom and people having agency over either their own self or, the products that they purchased, the benefits and the moral correctness of that, I think, outweighs any potential inherent risks, because risk will be inherent no matter what to anything we do. The conclusion that is drawn here is that security threats could also be more likely if player data is no longer protected on official servers, as if corporations don't already collect data and abuse that shit. Although the government are, of course, supportive of businesses are able to implement end-of-life plans voluntarily, we do not think that a blanket requirement is proportionate or in the interests of businesses or consumers. It is not in the interest of businesses. That's why they lobby against it, but it certainly is in the interest of consumers. The petitions that have garnered millions of signatures have spoken loud and clear, and yet you sit there and talk about what's in our best interest when the consumers have spoken out loud about what they believe is in their best interest. The government then says our role is to ensure that those selling and purchasing games are clear about their obligations and protections under UK consumer law that is clearly flawed and incomplete due to the fact that companies are able to get away with far too much. The government then talks about the subject of video game preservation, saying the following on that front. The government recognizes the cultural value of games and actively support initiatives that promote and support that, whether through cultural institutions such as the National Video Game Museum and London Science Museum, digital distribution platforms, or individual video game companies donating their games and hardware to preservation organizations. We recognize that preserving games can be uniquely complex, in particular when they rely on specific hardware or software to function as intended. We welcome ongoing discussions between the industry, national museums, libraries, and archives about developing standards for game preservation. We encourage video game developers and publishers to continue considering preservation efforts when developing, releasing, and supporting their games. Like, this does absolutely nothing. They encourage things to happen, but those things can't happen and are not incentivized to happen if there aren't laws in place to ensure that they happen. You keep talking about encouraging businesses to partake in these consumer-friendly actions or actions that are, overall good for the long-term history of gaming, but corporations have no interest in any of that. All they care about is making money, which is why unless there are laws in place to force them to do certain things that are overall good for the industry and for the business and for the preservation of history and for consumers, they have no reason to do it, and they won't. You encouraging them to do it doesn't mean that they will. You encouraging them to take action doesn't do jack shit. That's what their governments and legislations and laws, because simply encouraging someone to do or not do something isn't enough. There have to be consequences for actions that do not overall serve, quote unquote, the greater good of something. Yeah, the ultimate conclusion drawn by the government is that we do not think that mandating end-of-life plans is proportionate or enforceable, but hey, at least they recognize the concerns of gamers about whether information on what they are purchasing is always sufficiently clear. To me, that's just the equivalent of sending thoughts and prayers, like, just keep them. Your recognition of concerns doesn't do shit if you don't do anything actionable. Recognizing concerns means jack shit if you don't enforce any laws that help prevent those concerns. And also, the concern from gamers isn't about whether things are sufficiently clear. It's whether the products that they purchase from game companies will one day get stolen from them or not. That's the concern. As for what the future holds, they say here, following this debate, our two departments will consider the case for asking the Institute to develop guidance to help businesses to ensure that the information provided to video game consumers accurately reflect existing consumer protections. It is vital to take into account the right of consumers while continuing to support the growth of our world-leading video game industry with its benefits to the wider economy. So yeah, as far as the most recent legislative discussions are concerned surrounding Stop Killing Games, it's a big old dud. Now, in the grand scheme of things, this is one minor setback. There's still the European Union, the European Citizens Initiative, the one that garnered, 1.4 million signatures. They're still counting signatures on that front. And once those signatures are verified, the European Union will come together and discuss this issue. And that's the one that's really going to matter. That's going to be like the Super Bowl of this discussion. But as far as UK specifically is concerned, unfortunately, the government's inability to really sympathize with consumers' concerns, sympathizing more for game corporations instead, has paved the road to this being a bit of a setback when it comes to realizing the normalization of what Stop Killing Games is asking for. But just because we've lost one battle doesn't mean that the proverbial war is over. Far from it. And I'll keep reporting on this as new developments come by. But in terms of the latest happenings, this is everything you need to know. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on the UK government's deliberations and their excuses and responses and their statements surrounding this whole issue and why they deliberated the way they did in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.